Hello! In this video, we will go through an experimental Python library for scraping websites using OpenAI's GPT. It's called Scrapeghost, and I'll be going through the tutorial provided by the developer, James Turk, to get to grips with how it works and just running through it step by step, and then I'll apply that to a totally different website to scrape a bit of information from there. And with those two examples, hopefully you'll also have a good idea of how you might use this tool to do a little bit of web scraping prototyping or even solve some important use case. So let me just cover the conceptual basics. It's pretty simple as far as I take it. We'll have a Python script which we point to a certain website that we've selected. We say that, hey, take a look at this website and maybe narrow it down to only the parts we're interested in and give that to ChatGPT. Say, hey, go through these parts of the website and bring back the result as it fits a certain schema that we define. For example, bring me back the episode title and number from this website that contains a whole list of episode titles and numbers. That then gets passed over to the OpenAI ChatGPT model through the API, and it goes through the input and then returns the scrape results back to our script where we can then proceed to do whatever we want with that. So not terribly convoluted conceptually. However, it does mean that we will be accessing the OpenAI API, which does have a cost. Now, you need an OpenAI account to follow along, and to keep the costs very, very low, you can always stick to 3.5 turbo, where we're talking about fractions of a cent, the US dollar perhaps, for basic scraping. So it shouldn't be too prohibitive, but it is what's needed. Here I'm in VS Code, and I will just, before we get stuck into the tutorial itself, cover the basics of what I've got running here. I'm running Python 3.11, so you do want to be using Python 3.10 or above for good results here. And I've run and installed the library, the package already with pip install Scrapeghost, as well as pip install OpenAI to have the OpenAI module available. And I do have my OpenAI account active. Some caveats here as we start going through the tutorial. I'll maybe zoom in. It's very experimental, brand new, has so many things to do with all these AI tools. No guarantees are made about the stability of the API or the accuracy of the results, and it relies on the OpenAI API, licensed under the Hippocratic License 3.0, with more information available on this website. All right, so quick start. I'll jump over to the full tutorial. So prerequisites, install Scrapeghost. Well, we do have that with pip install Scrapeghost here in the Python terminal. Notice also that I'm running a virtual environment so that all those modules are only installed in that virtual environment, which is good practice running Python. Get yourself an OpenAI API key by creating an account, yes, and set a usage limit on your API key to avoid accidentally running up a large bill. Now, this project does set a distinct limit by default to the cost, so it won't run away, but it's a good idea to keep this in mind when making doing experiments with the OpenAI API. So we've got the OpenAI API key. We need to make it available somehow. A straightforward way is to make it available as an environment variable by running an export command. I have put it in a separate file called OpenAI-key, which I won't be sharing, and I can refer to it with this command. So to begin with, I'll just write import OpenAI. I'll make the text a bit bigger, maybe not, and then access that API key by pointing to the file. Path equals, it's just the same directory, OpenAI key file. So that'll give me access to the API key. And always good to keep in mind, it's like sharing your password to share your API key, so don't do it in public. Now let's write our scraper. The tutorial has a goal of getting a list of all the episodes of the podcast Comedy Bang Bang. And to do that, we'll need two kinds of scrapers, one to list all the episodes and one to get the details of each episode. Well, let's get stuck in. The URL for one episode is available here, Comedy Bang Bang, etc. So let's say we want to build a scraper that finds out each episode's title, number, and release date. We can create a schema scraper object and pass it a schema, so define those data fields. So let's import the schema scraper from Scrapeghost, import schema scraper, and from pretty print, import pretty print, so we can get our results in a nicer format. We will snatch the URL from here and then define our schema. So this will then vary depending on what you want to get the result as, and it will need to be something that ChatGPT can reasonably expect to find from whatever you pass it. So the data type is a title is a string, the episode number very sensibly is an integer, and the release date is going to be a string in this example. We then initialize that with an episode scraper variable, which is the schema scraper, where we just pass the schema. Now there are another number of options that you can read about in the documentation, and we'll look a little bit more as well. When we initialize a schema scraper, there are pre-processors and post-processors, as well as extra instructions and so on. We'll look at those in a bit. Now, let me get rid of that. Then we'll get the response. That will be the episode scraper for the URL. So we'll run the schema scraper for that specific URL here. We can then print what comes back with pprint, and then we can print total cost is whatever the OpenAI result tells it is, down to a few decimals. So there is no, I'll just read out what's here. There is no predefined way to define a schema, but a dictionary resembling the data you want to scrape, where the keys are the names of the fields, is a good place to start. And the values are the types of the fields. Once you have an instance of schema scraper, you can use it to scrape a specific page by passing it a URL or HTML. But if we try to run it, we'll get an error. So let's try. Whoa, the HTML has 11,958 tokens, whereas the maximum for the default model, GPT 3.5 Turbo, is only 4,096. So tokens, as you may have heard before, are limits, are things that GPT ingests and produces and charges for. And for GPT-3, we saw the limit for 3.5. For GPT-4, it's much larger, and one token represents about 3 characters. So we want to keep that down for functionality's sake, and also for keeping costs down. Note now also that the costs currently for GPT 3.5 Turbo are way, way, way cheaper than GPT-4. So like more than 10 times. More expensive to run one than the other. And there's going to be changes to the pricing, no doubt, as time goes by and new models come out. However, we don't necessarily want to be passing that entire website. Why would we? We've got a list there, so let's take a look at what it looks like. There's all kinds of HTML stuff on that site, so we don't need to pass open a ChatGPT any of this stuff. All these things. Basically, we just want to narrow it down to the key information as much as possible, to the stuff that we're actually interested in. So how do we do that? We have a preprocessor. A clean HTML preprocessor is included by default, which removes comments, script tags, style tags. Not necessary, but okay. So if we visit that page and view the source, we'll see that all the interesting content is in an element called div id equals content and in a class called page content. So let's just take that at the word. And if we were writing a real scraper, a regular scraper in Python, we'd have something like a CSS selector to say, hey, grab onto those parts in this structured page. So we'd be able to just use the div.page-content for the class name to narrow down what we're sending ChatGPT to something much more manageable. So now we're opening the schema scraper call here. And instead of just having the schema being passed in, we can say we'll add those extra preprocessors that we briefly mentioned before. So we'll add one saying it's going to point to that, but we do need to import CSS here as well from Scrapeghost to have that handy. Okay, and now if we run our code again, just following along the tutorial, see the API request goes in. Perfect, and we get a result, and what a wonderful result. We've got the episode number 800, the release date, March 12th, 2023, and Operation Golden Orb as the title. So marvelous, and if we go through there, we'll get the total cost as well. So that was 1/3 of a cent. Carrying on a little bit more with the tutorial. How wonderfully easy was that? I agree with the tutorial there. If we wanted to add the release date and the guests, we could do that. So we could, instead of having this as a string, we just say we want it in a date format, year, month, and date. And then we say the guests could be a list of just the names of the guests in the episode. Everything else can stay. But now if we run the same thing again, let's see what it says. Oop. All right, we'll just keep the release date as a string. One more time. We could point it to another page, but I think that's fine as it stands. And then the developer here correctly says that if you ever maintain a scraper for any amount of time, you know that the biggest burden is dealing with changes to the structure of the pages you're scraping. So we could try and get the same information from a different page. Okay, so that's how easy it is to get started. There are sections in the tutorial on dealing with page structure changes and extra instructions. So extra instructions would be things you can pass on to the ChatGPT prompt. So for example here, do not include the episode number in the title. That can then be parsed. And funnily enough, the tutorial says you may be wondering at this point if you'll ever need to write a web scraper again. So what's more difficult for Scrapeghost to handle is getting the details through all of the episode URLs. And if you go to the website page listing all the episodes, you discover that there's hundreds of thousands of tokens. And you really don't want to parse that. That's just very expensive and nuts. So in practice, at this point, you might want to be using Beautiful Soup or some other module instead to do it the more old-fashioned way. But if you didn't, there are some options that the library provides: an auto split length, where you can define the amount of tokens that it splits chunks by. So that's the maximum number of tokens that will be passed to OpenAI in a single request. And it will change the prompt and response format so that instead of returning a single JSON object, it will return a list of objects where each of those should match your provided schema. And then in this example, the schema is altered to be just a single string because it's just the URL that's being fetched. Can make 20 requests, but then it gets there. And here we have a safeguard mentioned. So the maximum cost for a single scrape operation is configured to $1 by default, but you can adjust that max cost parameter yourself. But yeah, not maybe the forte of Scrapeghost. It might be better for throwing an individual page at it and grabbing something from there when the page isn't humongous. And at the bottom we see the overall code for that. So part 1 of this video, we had some good success in fetching out data into our schema, and very handily indeed. Let's take a look at a totally different example from scratch then, and see if we can build our own little version. So here is Future Tools, a hip website of the moment, where we see a list of upcoming AI tools in particular. Now suppose you wanted to write a competitor for this site and make a quick buck. Maybe you'd want to be a bit naughty and scrape the list, this list of these options and links. So we might want to get the name and the link, let's say. So how do we do that? We've got the URL, futuretools.io, and then we could inspect this and try and find that selector that pins it down as close as possible to the relevant data, so that so we don't need to pass any more stuff than necessary over. So we could see that the link, here's a link, and there's the name. So we might get away with tool item text link block new being the div there. So let's pick that out, and let's start writing our new file for Future Tools. So we'll be importing OpenAI. Give it that API key path. Yes, imports. Get that URL, which is going to be futuretools.io. Correct. And then we're going to have a little scraper. Right, so if we wanted the tool name and the link, we can just do it like that, define the schema. Auto split length, let's give it that. Let's explicitly restrict it to the older version to keep our cost low, and maybe set our max cost as well down to 1/10 of a dollar, 10 cents. For our preprocessor, let's try perhaps with that block we identified. I think that should do it. We can close our definition of the schema scraper. We can grab the response by passing our URL to the response, and then the tools, that list of tools and their links will just be whatever in that data response. And then we can print our responses here and print out the cost, and maybe at the end we could save that list down into a file. So using CSV, just a standard command, very, very standard way of just writing a dictionary tool and link from iterating through that tools array. However, we do then need to bring the standard CSV library in. So that seems to make sense for me, as long as this CSS selector does some good work. So we're applying the learning we just got from the tutorial, running this, and let's see what happens. Return no node. Oh, I think we need to have a full URL here. Let's try that. It's kicking off. Found an array of 10 chunks. And it's going through those. Sweet, we're getting results. There we go. We scraped 102 future tools to the cost of about 3 cents and a bit. And we ended up with a tools CSV where they're all nicely listed. And we can then do what we want with them instead of having to manually copy them. So that worked very easily. Hope that was entertaining to you. I think this is an interesting development, and certainly would consider using it for the occasional web scrape prototyping I need to do now and then. But more importantly, I think it heralds the one of the many directions in which knowledge work will be changing, where soon enough we should be able to very simply just tell and plugin enabled ChatGPT or competitor to go to a site and pick out this data. So bring me a list of the tools and links from future tools. Could be a prompt or a seed of a prompt. And then all these few steps that we went through here will just be handled by the AI itself. So another exciting development that may free us a little bit from menial tasks, but it's certainly fun to play with. So big thanks to the developer here. Big thanks to you for watching, and don't forget to have a great day.